Hello friends, now let's begin with the GS2 syllabus. In this video, I'll be covering the first topic of the GS2 syllabus, that is the features of the Indian Constitution. Broadly, the features of the Indian Constitution can be studied under two heads, that is the objective features as well as the philosophical features. The objective features of the Indian Constitution are as follows. Indian Constitution is one of the lengthiest written constitutions of the world. It is also drawn from several sources. The Indian Constitution is a mix of rigid as well as flexible features. The philosophical features of the Indian Constitution are as follows. There is an indestructible basic structure of the Indian Constitution. The Constitution codifies its nature, vision, principle, values and so on in the Preamble. The Indian Constitution is also able to do a happy reconciliation of diverse ideologies. Throughout this presentation, I'll be discussing all these features in detail. Let's begin with one of the most important qualitative or the philosophical feature of the Indian Constitution, that is the basic structure. Now, the words basic structure are nowhere mentioned explicitly in the Indian Constitution. The doctrine of basic structure was given by the judiciary through several judicial judgments, beginning with the Kesavananda Bharati case, 1973. The doctrine of basic structure is the result of the tussle between the legislature and the executives. The basic idea of this doctrine of basic structure is that there are certain features of the Indian Constitution which are non-amendable and indestructible. If you remove or amend these basic features, then the rest of the articles and schedules and provisions of the Constitution do not make any sense. In a way, we can say that these basic features are like the soul of the Indian Constitution. The judiciary has given the components of the basic structure through several judicial pronouncements. This doctrine of basic structure comprises rule of law, democracy, parliamentary form of government, secularism, and so on. So in short, we can say that it is on the basic structure that all the provisions and all the schedules and articles and amendments of the Constitution are based. Another important qualitative or philosophical feature of the Indian Constitution is that it does a very happy reconciliation of diverse ideologies, be it liberalism, socialism, individualism, Gandhism, feminism, and so on. Like for example, liberalism is seen through fundamental rights and so on. Socialism is seen through the welfare state orientation of the Indian state. Communitarianism is seen through the fundamental duties enshrined in the Indian Constitution. Individualism is seen through the fundamental rights and freedom of speech and expression, and so on. Gandhism is seen through the organization of panchayats, special features for the weaker sections like SC, STs, and so on. Feminism is seen through the gender equality, and so on. So you see, the Indian Constitution has been able to do a very happy reconciliation of a diverse array of ideologies. Next is the Preamble. Preamble is one of the most important features of the Indian Constitution. The Preamble narrates the grand vision, objectives, and the morals and ethics on which the Indian Constitution and all its provisions are based. The question whether the Preamble is a part of the Constitution of India came before the Supreme Court in the famous Kesavananda Bharati case 1973. In this case, the Supreme Court said that the Preamble is a part of the Indian Constitution and that the Preamble is amendable. However, the basic structure contained in the Preamble is not amendable. Another important feature of the Indian Constitution are the feministic credentials of the Constitution. There are detailed provisions in the Constitution which upheld the feminism and the feministic credentials. Like the Indian Constitution upholds gender equality, there are provisions against patriarchy, the fundamental rights, fundamental duties, and the universal adult suffrage all are granted equally to women at par with men. The fundamental duty to renounce the practices derogatory to women explicitly narrates the feministic credentials of the Indian Constitution. The feministic credentials of the Indian Constitution is perhaps the most important feature of the Indian Constitution. At this point, I would also like to mention that the Indian Constitution granted universal adult suffrage and equal rights to women at par with men. This was not seen even in case of the American Constitution. In America, the women had to wage a very long war to seek equal rights at par with men. However, in the Indian context, the Indian constitution granted equal rights and universal adult suffrage at a stroke of a midnight. Now let's have a look at the objective or the factual features of the Indian constitution. Indian constitution is one of the lengthiest written constitutions of the world. It has 12 schedules, 450 articles, and the Indian constitution has undergone more than 120 amendments. There are several reasons why the Indian constitution is a very lengthy and a bulky document. These reasons are as follows: the sheer geographical expanse of the India, the dominance of the legal luminaries in the Constituent Assembly. There are several historical factors as well. Like for example, the Indian Constitution borrows heavily from the Government of India Act of 1935, and this act in itself was a very bulky and a very lengthy text, and so the Indian Constitution also happens to be a very lengthy document. Also, there is a single constitution in India. In case of America, there are two constitutions, one at the central level, and each state has its own constitution. This is not seen in case of the Indian context. We have a single constitution, and so this single constitution has very detailed provisions related to administrative and several other provisions. Another important feature of the Indian constitution is that it is drawn from several other constitutions and several other sources. Like for example, the Indian constitution borrows heavily from the Government Act of 1935. The fundamental rights enshrined in the Indian Constitution are drawn from the American Constitution. The fundamental duties mentioned in the Indian Constitution are inspired from the Russian Constitution. The directive principles of the state policy are inspired from the Irish Constitution, and so on. Also, it is important to note that the Indian Constitution does not do a blind cut-paste of these features. The Indian Constitution has taken several progressive features from the rest of the constitutions of the world, and these features are interpreted and applied in the Indian context. Let me explain this thing with a small example. Take the example of, say, secularism. We can say that the Indian model of secularism is inspired from the French model of secularism. However, there is significant difference between the French model of secularism and the Indian notion of secularism. The French notion of the secularism is somewhat negative idea of secularism, and it connotes indifference towards the religion. However, the Indian Constitution connotes a positive idea of secularism, and that equal respect for all religions is an important feature of the Indian secularism. Also, the Indian secularism is inspired from the Gandhian notion of secularism, and secularism in Indian Constitution implies Sarva Dharma Samabhav. So in a way, we can say that the Indian Constitution is a bag of borrowings, and it draws heavily from the rest of the constitutions of the world. And the Indian Constitution has borrowed the progressive features and progressive aspects from the rest of the constitutions of the world. Another important feature of the Indian Constitution is that there is a blend of flexibility and rigidity in the Indian Constitution. The Indian Constitution is flexible in a sense that a large number of the provisions can be amended by simple majority in the Parliament. Provisions related to citizenship, creation of new state, and so on can be altered and can be amended through simple majority in the Parliament. At the same time, the Indian Constitution is also rigid, and many important provisions of the Indian Constitution can only be amended by special majority in the Parliament. Also, the provisions related to the federal aspects of the Indian Constitution can only be amended with special majority in the Parliament and ratification by at least half of the states. The next important feature of the Indian Constitution is its federal system with unitary bias. Federalism, in short, means the presence of two governments, that is the central government and the state government. There is a written constitution, there is rigidity and supremacy of the constitution, independent judiciary, and so on. Even if the Constitution of India is federal, there are unitary features there in the Indian Constitution. Even if the Constitution of India has adopted federalism, there are unitary features present in the Indian Constitution. These unitary features are as follows: single citizenship, emergency provisions, single constitution, and so on. In a way, we can say that the flexibility and rigidity allows the Indian Constitution to meet the aspirations of the Indian people. The flexibility allows the Indian Constitution to modify itself as per the need of time, while the rigidity allows the Constitution to be rigid and strong. Another feature of the Indian Constitution is its adoption of the parliamentary form of government. Parliamentary form of government in short means the executives have the membership in the legislature. Like for example, the Prime Minister and the entire Council of Ministers have the membership of the legislature. They are the member of the parliament. Unlike the parliamentary form of government in India, there is presidential form of government in the United States of America. In the USA, the president is not the member of the American Parliament. There are several reasons why the Indian Constitution has adopted the parliamentary form of government and not the presidential form of government. One of the important reasons is that there is harmony between the executives and the legislature in case of the parliamentary form of government. Another important objective feature of the Indian Constitution is the synthesis of parliamentary sovereignty and judicial supremacy. Parliamentary sovereignty is seen in case of the British Constitution and judicial supremacy is seen in case of the American Constitution. Another feature of the Indian Constitution is the independent and integrated judiciary. The Constitution has provided detailed provisions which ensure the independence of the judiciary. Like for example, there is security of tenure for judges and so on. Also, there is an integrated judiciary in India. We have the apex court, that is the Supreme Court, below which there are high courts, below which we have the district courts and so on. This is not so in case of the American context, where the American Supreme Court can only enforce and enact the central laws, whereas the state courts in case of America enforce and enact the state laws. This is not so in case of the Indian context. In India, the Supreme Court as well as the high courts can enact and enforce the state laws as well as the central laws. Now, there are several other objective features of the Indian Constitution like the fundamental duties, presence of fundamental rights, directive principles of state policy, secularism, single constitution, three-tier structure of the federalism and so on. In a way, we can say that the Indian Constitution and all its features seek to strengthen the democracy in India. It seeks to cultivate the spirit of democracy and nurture civic virtues in India. The Indian Constitution, through its features and provisions, seeks to realize the grand vision of the Indian freedom struggle. It seeks to realize justice, preserve unity, independence and sovereignty of India. In a way, we can say that the Indian Constitution is not just a legal document, it is also a social document. The very preamble says that we the people of India. It means that the Indian Constitution is also a social contract and that the Constitution is based on the consent rendered by the people of India. Summarizing the discussion on the Indian Constitution and all its features, I would like to make an important point. It is important to note that India has continued with the same constitutions since the independence, and this shows the strength, relevance, adaptability of the Indian Constitution to meet the aspirations of India. There are several countries in the world which have brought in several versions of the Constitution. However, this is not so in case of India. India has continued with the same Constitution and it has been modified to meet the aspirations of people. So all this shows the very strength and vitality and the very relevance of the Constitution. While you write the answers on the Indian Constitution and its features, do write this point. It shows how the Constitution is relevant and it shows the very essence of the Constitution. So with this, we conclude the topic of the Indian Constitution and its features. Hope you've enjoyed the video. Thank you so much.